So, what are we aiming for? This is our agenda for today. Well, we really want to take a look at the HVM ethos, HVM being the Hearing Voices movement ethos. We'll take a look at what are the creative arts therapies again, because I know that that is not something that everyone is familiar with. The connection between the arts and sensory phenomena. And that tends to be the language that I use. So as opposed to saying something like hallucinations, I'm more inclined to use language that again deconstructs some of those experiences. So I typically will say, sensory phenomena to describe that. Role play. So we'll talk a little bit about mask making and avatar therapy, voice mapping and the social atom, some embodiment work and what are called sculpts, which are also with the body, sand tray. And talk a little bit about improvisation, and then the value in consuming and creating arts together and how you can advertise if you are someone who's trying to reach out and connect with others on this, how you might consider advertising a creative arts therapy group to folk or just a creative arts group. Doesn't need to be therapy, right? All right, so what are we aiming for here? The HVM ethos. And this may be familiar to many of you here, if you're drawn to ISPS, but I always think it's important to kind of reiterate what we're hoping to do when we do really solid, connected, creative work with folks. And the Hearing Voices movement is really rooted in this idea that hearing voices does not mean you are ill, right? So we're really thinking about the kinds of conversations that are often brought to folks when they do have experiences like voice hearing and such, where the automatic assumption is negative, that it goes right into a bad place, not even a sort of just noticing and taking it in, but a real immediate, like, okay, well, that's problematic, right? So we always want to stick with this idea that, like, if you're hearing voices, if you're having these sensory phenomena, it's just part of human experience. People have all different ways that they experience the world around them, and it doesn't mean sickness automatically. Um, this one I really love, the idea that the voices can be relevant and meaningful, that we want people to speak freely. So why do I specify that? A lot of folks who may be in this room right now who do describe things like hearing voices, seeing visions, and so on, have the experience of being kind of dismissed or invalidated in their experiences. Sort of a, let's not talk about that, that's not important. And conversation gets shut down. But with the Hearing Voices movement, we want to really take some time and acknowledge that for some people, right, everything is for some people, because it varies from person to person. It's such a unique experience. But for some people, voices, visions, and so on are really very clearly connected to lived experience, to emotional state, right? So it might be something that someone experiences almost as a type of flashback, where maybe something that they experienced before, as opposed to remembering it in their mind's eye, they may actually see it more as something that they hear, right? And then additional supports. I like to throw in the additional supports part, because I just like that reminder that sometimes we have voices and visions and so on that are kind of delightful and really helpful and meaningful. And I've known a number of people, personal life, professional life, who hear voices and see visions, have tactile experiences that are actually very supportive and help them in grounding, that help them in emotion, like regulating emotional moments, that are actually really important to them. So we never want to dismiss the experience, because sometimes a particular voice is actually extremely healthy for someone. And there's also the value in acknowledging that voices may be relevant because voices, visions, again, I know it's a little bit of a reductionist term, hearing voices, or sort of all of these different sensory phenomena. That's what I'm referring to. Um, sometimes that is an indication to someone of how they're feeling, right? Um, so I think of a really dear friend of mine who knows that when one particular voice shows up, that voice kind of gives her a heads up that she's not feeling safe in the moment. So she doesn't always have that understanding in other ways to sort of gauge her feeling of comfort with people. But there's one voice that will sort of be like, hey, this person doesn't feel safe to me. And it's an intense voice. And sometimes it can be kind of harsh. But in learning that it connects to her feelings of like not so safe, insecurity, it's actually been extremely beneficial for her. So again, these are experiences that may be extremely relevant to someone and also meaningful. We don't want to just dismiss and ask people to not talk about what they're experiencing. Um, the next one, really critical, various interpretations are welcome. So in some spaces, you'll see, I have been in spaces, I have worked in spaces where really there was one interpretation that was understood, and that was a very hardline psychiatric interpretation of what someone was hearing or seeing. And everything was rooted in this idea of like, this is a psychiatric problem, and there's an issue here, and this means that, your brain is not functioning properly, right? Some really rough kinds of language that could really be demeaning to people. And in a Hearing Voices group and Hearing Voices movement ethos, we're really thinking about all the different understandings that come into play. So if someone comes in and is very clear, hey, like this is connected to telepathy, this is connected to God, this is connected to to something paranormal, whatever it is, or if someone does come in and say, hey, I understand this as a psychiatric experience, then that's also welcome, right? But none of those are forced on anyone. Whatever the interpretation is, it's like, yes, come in, be yourself, and all of it is okay. All of it's fine. We're not going to tell you that that's a problem. um, so there is an idea. I know for myself, I tend to be very rooted in the notions of trauma and how trauma impacts us, not just through sensory phenomena, but anxiety, depression, addiction, eating disorders, all of it. So there is a notion with the HV in the Hearing Voices movement that sensory phenomena is often connected to challenges in life history. Again, this is not a catch-all. People have different experiences, but very often there are folks who will say that, they over time can connect particular experiences to something that is challenging and a part of their story. And we keep in mind that if the voices are distressing, if they are if they are connected to some of these challenges, there are skills that people can learn to cope. So maintaining optimism, again, there's a lot of research that shows that in some of these very I'll say traditional medical model spaces, not everywhere, but in many of them, there's what's considered sort of like a clinical pessimism. And it's almost as if the clinicians themselves are coming in with this idea of like, oh, this is, I don't have much hope for this person because they're having this experience. It's something that is damaging to everybody, because typically the therapist, the clinician, whatever, doesn't feel so great about themselves because they're sort of like feeling at a loss. And also it gets communicated to it gets communicated to people who are trying to understand their experiences better, as this sort of like, don't get your hopes up, kind of lower your expectations a little, right? Like this messaging kind of comes through, whether it's on purpose or not, and can be so detrimental. So in the Hearing Voices movement, we're really saying like, hey, there are skills that if you want to shift the relationship you're having with this sensory phenomena, there are things you can learn to do, that you can practice, that you can co-create even with the voices themselves, with someone like me who offers support. Um, and we're really optimistic about that there's no reason why this experience doesn't mean you can't have the job that you want and go to the school and get the degrees that you want and have a partnership and be a parent if you want, right? all of these things that there was a time not too long ago, and sometimes currently as well, where again, if this is what's going on with someone, it just immediately becomes very pessimistic. Um, so the idea that you can cope, you can find ways to cope if that word is applicable to you, and that a lot of times connecting to some of the challenges in life history may be a component to that coping. So sort of again, better understanding some past traumatic events could be a part of it, or some emotional patterns that come up that voices seem to kind of represent a little bit. But it's really quite manageable for many folks. And then this one I love. Our measurements of success are not about erasing the experiences. That one is huge. It may be my favorite. Um, I'm sure many of you have heard or have been in places where it was like, well, the way we know this person is doing well is because they're not seeing that thing or hearing that thing anymore, right? Um, and suddenly we really have this very limited notion of what health looks like, and it's just not correct. So I have, again, I mean, I've been schooled in this myself, right? All the things that I had to unlearn, realizing that, like, oh, a lot of the healthiest people I know are voice hearers, are folks who have found amazing ways to connect with their voices or visions, or create different boundaries or partnerships, right? So that the voices and visions and so on were, the goal wasn't eliminating. The goal was figuring out a new way to interact that was more helpful. Um, so we're really kind of keeping that in mind as a major backbone to what we're doing. And also that no one solution is privileged. So if you're talking to me and you're someone who says, you know what, Tammy? I feel best if I just focus on my spirituality and, or health and nutrition, or for me, medication is really important. All of it's in, right? Like we don't erase any of that. Whatever someone comes in with and says, sorry, I have an extremely loving cat right now. So his name is Salem, Salem Angela Lansbury Cromwell, just in case you were wondering if you can see him. So we really sort of take in whatever that solution is. Um, it is welcome here, and we explore it together and how it's valuable for each person. So this is the framework we're working off of. Now, taking a look further, what are the creative arts therapies? So the creative arts therapies, again, so I'm going to give a little bit more formal discussion about that. Um, so they're creative interventions that have been formalized through the disciplines of art therapy, music therapy, dance movement therapy, drama therapy, psychodrama, poetry therapy, and play therapy, including sand tray therapy. And I'm sure there are other creative therapies that I'm missing in that, but it's basically the idea is it's some sort of an intervention. Doesn't need to be clinical, but a therapeutic intervention. That is really about, formally connecting with some form of artistic expression, artistic representation. There's a focus on a purposeful and deliberate use of creative expression as a means of addressing boundary setting, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, family systems, trauma, injustice, and psychological safety. Again, some of this is a bit more, some of it is a little clinical language, so it may or may not apply to folks. But again, it's sort of when you are trained as a creative arts therapist, it's not sort of like, I just run in the room and I say like, hey, let's talk about Shakespeare, right? Like if I'm coming in as a drama therapist, there's a particular reason why I want to utilize this particular scene. I think it might be relevant. So everything is really thought through as to how the arts might be resonating with a particular person, and how that can be used to literally or metaphorically help with other components of what's going on. Another thing is I actually wind up working with a lot of professional performers. Um, and for professional performers, creative arts therapies, we sort of need to remember that we're focusing on the product and the process and not the product. So that's something that kind of comes up often, is where folks will have concerns that if they enter into a creative arts therapy, that they need to produce something artistic that is indicative of talent or skill. That's not what we're talking about. What we're thinking about with creative arts therapies is, you could be on Broadway right now. You could be someone who just likes to sing in the shower. It really doesn't matter. What we're looking at is how this form of artistic expression actually helps with your mental health process. I'm going to take another sip of water here. And on the bottom, I just like to note here, so a lot of the things that I'm talking about here, there is in New York State a specific discipline called a licensed creative arts therapist. That's what my licensure and credentialing are in. And so that means that we've gone through specific master's programs, taken certain exams, had certain work experience in order to obtain that license. But what I do note is that, so, you know, while I will reference creative arts therapists, right? So that's where you're sort of coming in with a more deliberate, maybe clinical component, or, you're thinking of it as some sort of intervention, so to speak. What I want to remind everyone is that there are so many ways to incorporate the arts in order to connect. So whether you are an LCAT, as we're called, or you're someone who enjoys the arts, or, someone who is working in the helping professions, is working in any profession, is experiencing voices themselves. These are just some different ideas about how the arts may be utilized in general. Okay.